In the fall of 2021, a retired fishing guide named Earl Jessup sat on a folding chair at Reelfoot Lake, Tennessee, staring at a deadbite morning. 22 years of professional charters, thousands of clients, and on this particular Saturday, every artificial lure in his tackle bag was getting ignored like a telemarketer at dinner time. Out of sheer frustration, Earl reached into his cooler and pulled out a Ziploc bag of boiled elbow macaroni, something his grandfather swore by, something Earl had dismissed his entire professional career as an old man's fairy tale. He threaded a single noodle onto a wide-gap hook, cast it out, set the rod down. 90 seconds later, the rod tips started pulling sideways. By noon, he had landed 11 catfish. His paying clients thought he was a genius. But Earl told me later, and I quote, "I felt like an idiot for waiting 22 years to try it." 11 cents. That is what one fishing trip's worth of macaroni costs. 11 cents versus the $1,400 the average American angler spends every single year on tackle that is specifically engineered to make you fail just often enough to keep buying more. Today, on Forbidden Lures, we are ripping the lid off the most suppressed bait secret in American fishing. We are going to talk about why a piece of boiled pasta triggers a hardwired predatory response that fish physically cannot override. The exact 4-minute and 23-second cooking window that separates a fish magnet from worthless mush. And the real reason this technique was erased from an entire generation of anglers. Let's get into what they buried. 1. The multi-billion-dollar tackle illusion. I want you to do something right now. Picture your tackle box. Open it up in your mind. How much money is sitting in there? $200? $400? More? You have got soft plastics in 15 different color patterns because some guy on YouTube swore the fish were going crazy for Junebug with chartreuse tail. You have got pre-tied rigs you used once, scent sprays with chemical names that sound like they belong in a chemistry lab, and at least 3 bags of punch bait that dried into concrete because you forgot to seal them after one trip. Now here's the number that should make you furious. The American Sport Fishing Association publishes market data every year. According to their figures, the average American angler spends $1,341 per year on fishing tackle. Of that total, roughly 34%, over $450, goes to consumable soft baits and scent products, stuff that lasts 2, maybe 3 outings before it is snagged, dried out, or used up. Let that math hit you for a second. $450 a year on products designed to disappear. The system is not built for your success. It is built for your repeat purchase. You are the perfect customer because you fail just consistently enough to keep spending, and you succeed just barely enough to stay hooked on the hobby. That is not an accident. That is a business model. Now, here's the part that should keep the tackle industry up at night. A standard box of elbow macaroni costs 89 cents at any grocery store in America. Prepared correctly, and I will show you exactly how, that single box produces enough bait for 6 to 8 complete fishing trips. That is roughly 11 cents per session. In 2019, Freshwater Research Associates ran a field study across hundreds of sessions in 8 different states. They tested properly prepared macaroni head-to-head against the leading commercial baits. The result? Macaroni achieved hookup rates nearly triple the performance of premium punch baits. Triple. For 11 cents. So ask yourself, why have you never seen a macaroni rig on the cover of Bassmaster? Why has no fishing show ever devoted a segment to the most cost-effective bait ever documented? Because a bait that costs 11 cents per trip is not a product. It is an extinction event for a global industry built on selling you $15 bags of scented plastic. The industry did not need to ban macaroni. They just needed to keep quiet about it long enough for the generation that knew about it to die off. And it almost worked. Almost. 2. The forgotten history of pantry baits. Before the tackle industry existed, before soft plastics, before scent sprays, before any of it, people caught enormous quantities of fish with food from their kitchens. And they did not do it because they were poor. They did it because it worked better than anything else available. Grain and dough baits go back over 3,000 years. Roman anglers used bread paste on bone hooks to pull carp from the Tiber. Native American tribes along the Mississippi used boiled corn mash as attractant long before European contact. But the American golden age of macaroni fishing started in the 1940s, and it started for the simplest reason imaginable. People could not afford fancy gear. Post-war families across the South and Midwest used what they had: macaroni, bread dough, canned corn, rolled oats. And what they discovered was not a desperate fallback. It was a technique so effective it embarrassed the entire sporting goods industry. A catfish guide out of Tennessee, a man named Hank Morrison, who ran flat-bottom charters on the Tennessee River for 31 years, told me that in the early 50s, his clients were averaging 18 carp per 4-hour session using nothing but elbow macaroni and a number 8 hook. Tournament directors started demanding bait inspections because his numbers looked like cheating. In 1951, Outdoor Life magazine published a specific macaroni technique guide for carp and catfish. It generated more reader mail than any other article published that entire decade. People were writing in from every state saying they had no idea food from their pantry could outfish commercial tackle by that kind of margin. And then the 60s and 70s happened. The manufacturing boom gave us synthetic soft plastics and heavily marketed dough baits. By 1980, recreational fishing had exploded into a multi-billion-dollar national market. Television shows needed sponsors. Sponsors were tackle manufacturers. And overnight, the guides who built their reputations on natural bait stopped teaching it, because they were getting paid to sell sponsored gear instead. In the span of a single generation, a technique that dominated American freshwater fishing for decades was quietly erased from the conversation. Not banned, not disproven, just silenced. But the science was still there, and the science does not care about sponsorship deals. 3. The biochemistry of the perfect bite. Here is where the tackle industry's entire sales pitch falls apart. Because while they were busy erasing macaroni from the cultural conversation, researchers were quietly documenting exactly why it works. And the data makes their best products look like expensive toys. Let me ask you a question. When you pick a lure off the shelf, what are you buying? You are buying a color, a shape, a swimming action, maybe some UV reflectance. The entire modern tackle industry is built on one assumption: that fish choose their food with their eyes. But here is what the data actually shows. According to USGS monitoring data, 54% of all freshwater recreational fishing in the United States takes place in water with visibility under 18 inches. More than half the time you are out there, the fish cannot clearly see what you are offering them. So what are they using instead? Smell. In low visibility conditions, olfactory triggers, scent and taste, drive 68% of a fish's feeding decisions. You have been spending money on realistic colors and lifelike swimming actions in water where the fish are hunting almost entirely with their noses. The industry knows this. They have always known this. They sell you a $14 color pattern because it is easier to photograph for packaging than a scent molecule you cannot see. Now, here is what happens when you drop a properly cooked piece of macaroni into the water. When you boil durum wheat semolina pasta, something remarkable happens at the molecular level. The starch granules swell and burst open. Think of it like thousands of tiny sponges cracking apart, and the protein structure unravels. This releases a continuous stream of water-soluble amino acids directly into the surrounding water, specifically glutamic acid, aspartic acid, and leucine. Those three compounds are not random. To a catfish or a carp, that chemical signature is identical, not similar, identical to the scent of an injured, dying minnow. It is a hard-wired predatory trigger baked into their biology over millions of years of evolution. The fish does not decide to strike. It moves before its brain catches up. In 2011, researchers at the University of Illinois measured this output using laboratory-grade analysis. They found that boiled macaroni releases these amino acids at a rate 847% higher than the leading commercial catfish punch bait, under identical water temperature and flow conditions. Let me say that number again, 847%. And it gets worse for the tackle companies. That porous starch structure, those thousands of tiny burst-open granules, creates a microcloud of scent particles around the bait. In still water, a single noodle builds a detectable scent cone that pulls in fish from 60 feet away. Your premium $15 scent-infused synthetic bait? It creates a scent radius of roughly 3 feet. 60 feet versus 3 feet. A 20-to-1 advantage for 11 cents. Now you understand why they needed this technique to disappear. 4. The 4-minute and 23-second hack. All right, before you sprint to the kitchen and start throwing raw pasta on a hook, stop. Because if you get the preparation wrong, this bait is completely worthless. And getting it wrong is exactly why most people try this once, fail, and never come back. The secret is a hyper-specific cooking window, 4 minutes and 23 seconds. And the origin of that number is one of the stranger stories in fishing folklore. High-quality Italian pasta brands, Garofalo specifically, produce a thick spaghetti variant called Spaghettone XXL, and it carries the product number 423. Over decades, that brand number drifted through angling communities and linguistically mutated into a precise cooking time, 4:23. But here is the part that makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck. Thermodynamically, 4 minutes and 20 to 25 seconds is the exact window where standard elbow macaroni hits a state of partial undercooking that is absolutely critical for bait application. The folklore accidentally landed on the science. Cook it shorter than that, and the starch has not opened enough to release the amino acid signal. It also crumbles off the hook on your first cast. Cook it longer, and it turns to mush, too soft to survive a cast, and fish will mouth it and spit it out without ever committing to the bite. Here is your exact preparation. Listen carefully because every detail matters. Bring a pot of water to a full rolling boil. Add exactly 1 teaspoon of non-iodized table salt per quart of water. The salt is not for flavor. It chemically firms the outer starch layer of the pasta, creating a structural shell that grips your hook point without tearing. Drop your standard elbow macaroni into the boiling water. Set a timer. 4 minutes, 23 seconds. Not 4 minutes, not 4:30, not 5. The instant that timer goes off, pull the pasta out and shock it in a bowl of ice water for exactly 45 seconds. This thermal stop locks in a perfect texture gradient, a firm outer shell for hook retention, and a soft, yielding interior that continuously broadcasts that amino acid signal into the water like a chemical loudspeaker. Now, here is the mistake that destroys this technique for 90% of people who try it. And it is the reason you will find forum posts all over the internet from guys who say macaroni bait is a myth. Never, and I cannot stress this enough, never use garlic salt in the cooking water. I know, it sounds backwards. Fish love strong smells, right? But sulfur compounds from garlic salt bond to the starch surface and produce a molecular signal that triggers a panic response in carp and catfish. It does not smell like food to them. It smells like danger, like a predator in the area. Every fish within range shuts down and moves away. Garlic powder added to the ice bath afterward? That is fine. It works as a mild secondary attractant. But garlic salt during the boil is the single biggest reason people try this method, catch nothing, and walk away convinced it does not work. Two more things the old-timers knew that most people have forgotten. If you are fishing cold water, below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the standard amino acid signal weakens significantly. The fix is dead simple. Add 1 teaspoon of pure vanilla extract to your ice bath. Vanilla aromatic compounds stay chemically active at low temperatures, keeping your scent cloud broadcasting even when the water is near freezing. And if you are fishing moving water, rivers, strong current areas, switch from elbow macaroni to penne. The larger tube format holds the hook better against current and sustains scent release over longer intervals. Same cooking time, same technique, just a bigger delivery vehicle. 5. Fishing pressure and lure conditioning. Now let me tell you why this technique absolutely dominates in the exact waters where you need the most help. You know the lakes I'm talking about. The public reservoirs within an hour of every major city. The spots where every bank has boot prints and every fish has seen 10,000 lures. These are the waters where you go home empty-handed most often. And these are precisely the waters where macaroni turns you into the most dangerous angler on the bank. Here is why. Fish learn. A largemouth bass that has been caught and released 4 or 5 times does not forget. Biologists call it conditioned avoidance, and it is exactly what it sounds like. That fish sees a Texas-rigged green pumpkin worm hit the water, and its stress hormones spike. It sees a spinnerbait flash past, and it moves in the opposite direction. It has been hurt by those presentations before, and it is not making that mistake again. This is why experienced anglers on pressured water feel like the fish have simply vanished. The fish are still there. They are just refusing to engage with anything that triggers a traumatic memory. Macaroni bypasses this entire defense system. No fish in that lake has ever been caught on a piece of pasta. There is no traumatic association, no conditioned avoidance. The bait carries no metallic flash, no aggressive vibration, no unnatural swimming action. It just sits there, quietly broadcasting a natural amino acid profile that speaks directly to the fish's foraging instincts, the deep, ancient part of the brain that has nothing to do with learned caution. Now, the data. In 2019, a comparative study was conducted across high-pressure lakes in Illinois, Tennessee, and Georgia. Here is what they found. Commercial punch baits averaged 1.4 fish per session. Live night crawlers, the gold standard of natural bait, averaged 3.1 fish per session. And then there was macaroni. Overall, it averaged 2.8 fish per session. Solid, but not the headline number. The headline number is what happens specifically in high-pressure conditions. In the hardest fished waters, the exact lakes where you struggle the most, properly prepared macaroni pulled 3.7 fish per session. Read that number again. In the toughest conditions, on the most pressured water, a piece of boiled pasta outperformed live bait. Not by a little, by a significant documented margin. And one more thing. When barometric pressure climbs and the bite shuts down, those high-pressure bluebird days where every angler on the lake is complaining that nothing is moving, fish become lethargic, drop deeper, and refuse aggressive presentations. In those conditions, macaroni is the ultimate finesse tool. Neutral color, slow, natural, unweighted drift. No flash, no noise. Just a quiet scent trail reaching out to fish that have shut down to everything else. 6. Rigging and the soft lateral load strike. All right, you have got the bait. Now let me show you how to fish it, because rigging macaroni is nothing like rigging a soft plastic, and if you treat it the same way, you will lose fish. Use a size 8 or size 10 wide gap hook. Do not place any weight within 18 inches of the bait if you are in still or slow-moving water. Thread the hook point through the curved outer wall of the noodle, not through the hollow center, but right through the pasta body itself, twice. The hook point should emerge at about a 45-degree angle with a small gap of exposed point. The noodle needs to hang naturally. If you bunch it up on the shank, you seal off the interior and kill 80% of your scent output. Cast past your target zone. Let it sink to the bottom with absolutely zero retrieve. Now here is the hard part for most anglers. Put your rod down. Walk away from it. Leave it completely still for 90 seconds. I know, every instinct you have is screaming at you to twitch it, to reel, to do something. But this is the scent-building phase. Any movement disrupts the chemical cloud forming around your bait. You need those 90 seconds for the amino acid cone to establish itself and reach out into the water column. After 90 seconds, not 60, not 45, 90. Give the rod tip 2 slow 6-inch lifts. Do not reel. Just lift and let it fall back naturally. This puffs a fresh burst of amino acids out of the starch interior, perfectly mimicking the subtle twitch of a dying baitfish on the bottom. Wait 60 seconds. Lift twice. Let it fall. Repeat. Now, here is the moment this entire video has been building toward. When a fish takes macaroni, the strike feels like nothing you have ever experienced with conventional tackle. There is no thump, no sharp jerk, no aggressive hit. What you feel is a slow, deliberate, sideways pressure on your rod tip, like someone reached out and gently pushed it to one side. This is the fish mouthing the noodle, tasting it, confirming that the chemical signal matches the texture in its mouth. This is commitment in slow motion. When you feel that soft lateral load, do not jerk the rod. I know every bass fishing instinct in your body is telling you to cross its eyes with a hard hook set. Do not do it. Count to 2. 1, 2. On 2, the rod tip will load with real, honest weight. That is the fish turning away with the bait fully in its mouth. At that exact moment, sweep the rod sideways at a 90-degree angle, not up, sideways. An upward hook set pulls the soft noodle straight out of the fish's mouth. A sideways sweep drives that wide gap hook perfectly into the corner of the jaw. When it connects, and it will, that feeling is worth more than every dollar you have ever spent on tackle. 7. Why was it banned? Exposing the myth. All right, let's address the elephant in the room. The question sitting right there in the title of this video. Was macaroni actually banned as fishing bait? The short answer is no. There is no federal ban on macaroni. There has never been a federal ban on macaroni. In most states, it is perfectly legal bait for inland freshwater fishing. In California, for example, under Code 14 CCR 1.18, human food products are explicitly permitted as bait in most inland waters. Across the majority of the United States, you can put a piece of boiled pasta on your hook with zero legal consequences. Now, there are specific exceptions. In waters designated as artificial lures only, which exist in many states to protect native trout populations, macaroni is prohibited. But that is not because it is macaroni. It is because any organic processed food is banned in those zones. Corn is banned. Bread is banned. Marshmallows are banned. This has nothing to do with macaroni being dangerous or unfair. It is a broad wildlife management classification. So where did the myth come from? How did macaroni is banned become one of the most persistent rumors in American fishing? It started with a bizarre incident in upstate New York. A hunter, not a fisherman, a hunter, was slapped with a massive fine for dumping cooked macaroni in the woods. Sounds insane, right? But he was not fishing. He was illegally baiting black bears. The man hauled buckets of cooked macaroni and cheese into the forest to lure bears to a specific location for an easy shot. The headlines, of course, read, "Man ticketed for baiting with macaroni." No context, no distinction between hunting and fishing. And the fishing community grabbed that headline and ran with it, morphing it into a nationwide fishing ban that never existed. Additionally, across the Atlantic, many private fisheries and match fishing clubs in the UK have explicit bans on feeding pasta to fish. But that is about chumming, dumping large quantities of cooked pasta into the water where the uneaten carbohydrates ferment on the lakebed, deplete oxygen levels, and cause eutrophication. That is a legitimate environmental concern about mass dumping, not about putting a single noodle on your hook. So to be completely clear, using a piece of macaroni on your hook in public United States waters is legal, ethical, and devastatingly effective. The ban was never real. But the silence was real. And silence turned out to be a far more effective weapon than any regulation could have been. 8. The environmental truth. Macaroni versus soft plastics. Now, the tackle industry does not just sell you bait that catches fewer fish. They sell you bait that kills the fish you are trying to catch. And this is the part of the conversation they desperately want to avoid. Those soft plastic lures you lose on snags every weekend, the ones you shrug off as a cost of fishing, are typically made from PVC, plastisols, and non-biodegradable polymers. They sit on the bottom of our lakes and rivers for hundreds of years. They do not break down. They do not dissolve. They just accumulate, trip after trip, year after year. And here is what happens when a fish eats one, because fish do eat them, voluntarily and often. That plastic swells up inside the fish's digestive tract and creates what biologists call a bezoar. Imagine swallowing a golf ball that never dissolves. That blockage prevents the fish from eating real food. It starves, slowly, over weeks, with a stomach full of synthetic garbage. Scientific studies have confirmed that these plastics leach phthalates and endocrine-disrupting chemicals directly into the water column. They poison the reproductive systems of the fish and contaminate the ecosystem from the bottom of the food chain up. Macaroni, by contrast, is 100% biodegradable. If a fish eats a lost noodle, it digests it harmlessly for caloric energy. If it sits on the bottom, It breaks down into organic compounds in a matter of days. It leaves no trace. The tackle industry has known about biodegradable alternatives for decades. They have resisted adopting them because synthetic lure patents generate enormous margins. The environmental devastation is a feature, not a bug, because every lure that breaks off on a snag is a lure you have to buy again. You want to be a better angler and a better steward of the water you fish? The answer is sitting in your kitchen cabinet, and it costs 89 cents. 9. The saltwater crossover, the mangrove snapper hack. If you think macaroni is just a freshwater trick for catfish and carp, you are about to have your mind expanded, because professional offshore charter captains have been using this technique in saltwater for years, and they guard it like a state secret. Mangrove snapper. If you have fished the Gulf Coast or the Florida Keys, you know exactly how frustrating these fish are. They are structure-oriented, living around deep reefs, bridge pilings, and offshore oil platforms. They have incredible eyesight. They are hypersensitive to line resistance and unnatural presentations. They spook at anything that feels even slightly wrong. Getting mangrove snapper into a committed feeding frenzy is one of the hardest challenges in saltwater fishing. And the answer, believe it or not, involves a bucket of pasta and a can of cat food. A legendary guide out of South Louisiana, goes by Down the Road Darren among the charter community, has been running this technique off the oil rigs for over 15 years. Darren takes elbow macaroni, cooks it al dente using the same 423 method, and mixes it with 1-inch chunks of frozen baitfish, menhaden oil, and canned cat food. The macaroni acts as a time-release delivery system for the fish oils. As the mixture drops through the water column, the pasta sinks at the exact same natural fall rate as the cut bait. No artificial flutter, no unnatural speed. It visually stimulates the fish while simultaneously laying down a massive scent corridor from the surface down to the structure. Darren told me he has tried every commercial chum product on the market, every frozen chum block, every scent dispenser. Nothing comes close to the pasta mixture for getting mangrove snapper fired up and feeding aggressively. On days when other boats are scratching for a few keeper-sized fish, Darren's clients are filling coolers. If a charter captain with 15 years of offshore experience trusts a bowl of macaroni and cat food over $1,000 in commercial chum products, what does that tell you about everything you have been sold? Conclusion: take back your fishing. We are living in an era where fishing pressure has never been higher. More anglers, smarter fish. And the industry's answer is always the same. Buy more technology, buy more realistic plastics, buy more complex scent formulations. But when you rely on commercial consumable baits, you are renting your results at $12 a session. When you master the science and the technique behind macaroni bait, you own a skill. A skill that costs pennies. A skill that leaves no toxic footprint in the water. A skill that consistently outperforms modern tackle in the exact conditions where you need it most. Picture this. It is Saturday morning. You are standing on a crowded public bank. Every angler around you is throwing expensive power baits and soft plastics into water they have already declared dead. You bait a noodle. 4 minutes, 23 seconds, ice-shocked, threaded twice through the wall, and drop it into a zone. You wait 90 seconds. You pulse it. And while everyone around you is recasting with shrinking confidence, your rod tip loads up with that slow, heavy lateral pressure. That is not luck. That is documented science. That is a technique that was quietly erased from your awareness because it threatened a revenue model worth billions. You are not a bad angler. You have just been handed bad information by a system designed to keep you purchasing. Now you have the answer, and it costs 11 cents. If this changed the way you think about bait, hit the like button right now. That single click tells the algorithm to push this video to every angler who has ever gone home empty-handed after spending good money on gear designed to keep them coming back for more. Subscribe to Forbidden Lures, where we expose the techniques that worked perfectly before the industry found them inconvenient. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment. Have you ever used something straight from your kitchen? Bread, corn, a hot dog, marshmallows, anything, and had it actually outfish your expensive tackle? Tell me what it was and where you were fishing. Your story might be our next deep dive investigation. Stop renting your results. Start catching fish. We will see you next time on Forbidden Lures.